Okay, so before we begin this video, I just wanted to quickly let everyone know that things on this channel might be slowing down even further in the coming months. Why? Well, primarily because I'm finally working on the most important and comprehensive video this channel has ever released. I've been writing the script for this video since around March of 2012, believe it or not. All of the pieces I could scrounge together are now coming together, so I'm going to be spending a lot of time recording necessary B-roll footage, voiceover, and editing it all together. Hopefully you'll stick around for it, because I think it'll be worth the wait. Mega Man Zero was a series that I was always dying to play when I was a teenager, as the games were slowly releasing. I had a Game Boy Advance by the time the second one came out, maybe the first, but I also couldn't often justify the prices for handheld games, because they also required expending batteries at an enormously fast rate if you put real time into them. And I didn't know anyone with a Game Boy player for the GameCube, so I couldn't just play them that way instead. It wasn't until a couple of years after the fourth game released that I started emulating GBA games on my PC. Among the plethora of other most popular titles on the console, the Zero games were ones I prioritized playing. With so many games to choose from though, and with Zero 1 being so difficult, I never finished any of them. I got around 3/4 of the way through the first game, and played a handful of stages of all the others before spending much more time on Pokemon Emerald, the DBZ Legacy of Goku titles, and the Battle Network games, which I was actually surprised I liked so much. Still, at the time, I was dying to play more of the Zero titles, and continued to sing their endless praises to everyone based off of my previous experience. I loved the new mechanical ideas in the series, and was confident that the difficulty of Zero 1 in particular was due mostly to the fact that I was using the arrow keys and keyboard buttons on my laptop to play. After all, I'd mastered X1 and X4 by playing so much of them, and I'd played a lot of the other X titles as well. I wasn't new to how challenging these games could be. I went back to the Zero games just over a year ago, or more specifically, I intended to go back to them all, and ultimately only played through Zero 1. The difficulty definitely wasn't just because I'd been playing on a keyboard. Despite the mountains of skill I've gained over the subsequent years playing games, my extra experience with every other Mega Man title, switching to a PS4 controller, and my previous experience with the game itself, Zero 1 was still insanely brutal. Unfortunately, it's not really fair difficulty a lot of the time either, or rather, it's not fair for a learning player. This game is one that's similar to Donkey Kong Country, for anyone who has seen my review of that. It's a game that has a gloriously positive reputation, but enjoying the fruits of its design requires a lot of qualifiers, namely a ton of experience with the game already. Mega Man Zero is a game that loves to punish players who struggle along the way, only making attempts to succeed even more difficult. What's more, it punishes using many of its mechanics, making its ranking system and one of its major secrets incongruous with the rest of the design. If you decide to toss the ranking system aside though, and play the game to its fullest, that means you've got a ton of grinding ahead of you, even if you optimize said grinding for efficiency. My in-game time by the end was about 5 hours, though I probably spent more like 8 hours playing. Around half of that was grinding. Mega Man Zero is ultimately another game that I think people give too much credit. It has worlds of potential, but it steps on that potential almost the entire way through, until you get really good at the game, at which point it can come to life in most respects. And that's important, by the way. I don't want to devalue that experience, but for the new player, you'd better have a lot of patience for unfair design. Also, yes, I know my footage is stretched. No, I don't care. I think the Zero games look fine stretched. If that bothers you, well, play the games however you want. It's hard to decide where to start with Zero now that we're diving in. Similar to a lot of games that are almost great, they fail largely because each system has something small wrong with it that cascades like dominoes with all of the others. Since they all relate, it's difficult to find an entry point to talk about. I guess the simplest way to start would be to explain that the game takes after Mega Man X mechanically. Not only is it a story continuation, taking place after Zero is revived, but it also carries over many of the mechanics from X while bringing in new ones. You have the slide dash, you can climb walls, and you have access to the Z-Saber and Buster Shot, which is effectively the X-Buster. It's all pretty standard until you gain access to your first Cyber Elf, which will probably happen very early on. Cyber Elves serve two purposes. Firstly, they can act as one-use items that can do things like heal you, slow down timers, remove every enemy in a stage except for the boss, and even cut the health of bosses down. You can hold 3 of these at once to use at any time during a stage, but once you use one, it's gone for good. The other type of Cyber Elf offers Zero permanent upgrades, which range from sub-tanks to hold extra health, maximum health upgrades, and a defense upgrade, to faster movement speed, slower falling while climbing, the removal of all spikes across the game, and even the removal of knockback. Using these Cyber Elves consumes them as well, but since it's a permanent upgrade, that makes sense. On its surface, this system is interesting and engaging. As I said, you can only use a Cyber Elf once before it's gone for good. You can't go back to the stage you found it in and pick up another. You get a fair handful of each of the consumable ones, and most of the permanent upgrade variants can be returned to obtain if you miss them the first time around, or can't really be missed in the first place. All good, right? Well, the two problems come in actually using the permanent elves and a few of the more powerful consumable ones, and the ranking system in the game. For some baffling reason that makes absolutely no sense, these elves need to first be leveled up to use. You level them up with energy crystals you can collect in stages, or that are dropped from defeating enemies. For most of these elves, you need a lot of crystals. I got to the end of the game having explored every stage pretty thoroughly, and even got stuck in a death loop where I was struggling with a section that had an extra life in it, and still had to spend around 4 hours grinding at the end to get most, not all, most of the permanent upgrades. 3 of the elves even have to be leveled up twice to use, and a few, I think 4 specifically, of the consumable ones also have to be leveled up. This is honestly absolutely obnoxious, because it means that if you're not grinding, there's a high chance you'll only be able to get 1 of the 3 largest upgrades, or 2 of the 4 smaller ones across the entire game, without grinding. And while there's a place in the beginning you can easily grind in, and one in the end that's less efficient but still works, it still takes far too long. Some people argue you can just use one of the Cyber Elves that guarantees enemies always drop items to speed it up. This is true in the former grinding spot, which you lose access to decently early on. It's not true in the latter spot, however. Normally, the enemies you want to defeat in this spot only drop energy crystals, not health. If you use this Cyber Elf, however, their drops become consistent, but they'll also start dropping health quite often, evening everything out and not making the grind faster. I genuinely don't understand why you have to grind anyway. The only permanent upgrade elf that isn't hidden in some way is the one that removes spikes. Similar to every previous Mega Man title, shouldn't it be enough that I found the upgrade because it was hidden, rather than having to grind it out along the way? The other issue with elves ties into the ranking system. At the end of each level, you'll get ranked on your performance: enemies defeated, time taken, damage taken, lives lost, and how many elves you used. Unfortunately, any permanent upgrades used will count against you in every subsequent stage. Getting an S rank and keeping it is already hard enough, but it basically becomes impossible if you use any permanent upgrades, whether it be life upgrades, sub-tanks, or anything else. Same goes goes for the consumables, but at least that's understandable. If you use most of the permanent upgrades, your rank is all but guaranteed to be trash. Thankfully, this doesn't have any effect in-game, other than allowing you to access a single room which has a cyber elf in it, if your rank is ever an A or higher, which you can do after the first stage. Though not getting this elf, missing any other elves, not grinding to max out every elf, or using any elves also makes it so that you can't get the ultimate cyber elf if you care about having access to fancy invincibility. Still, it isn't fun to have your rankings staring you in the face at every second during gameplay and mocking you at the end of every stage, nor does it feel like particularly great design to punish me for literally using one of the game's core mechanics. Why would you ask me to make the game less deep and engaging to get good rankings by not using a mechanic? Cyber elves aren't the only thing that need upgrades either, mind you. Weapon upgrades are a thing too in Mega Man Zero. Zero gains access to 4 weapons across the game: the Buster Shot, the Z-Saber, a new weapon known as the Triple Rod, and another new one known as the Shield Boomerang. The Buster Shot and the Z-Saber work like you'd expect them to. The Triple Rod allows you to pogo on enemies with a bit of finesse, and can attack in 8 directions. And the Shield Boomerang, go figure, works as a shield that you can also throw out like a boomerang that will come back to zero. While I primarily use the Buster Shot and Z-Saber, all of these weapons have some sort of use in the right hands. And it's nice that you have the option to pick whichever one you want, whenever you want, and that you can equip 2 at once. That being said, I'm torn on the fact that weapons also level up. They thankfully don't require energy crystals to do so. In a stroke of smart design, using them will level them up, giving you access to things like a larger combo, spin attacks, longer reach, charge attacks, and more. This is cool. The problem is that the system doesn't work like you, or indeed most of the internet, thinks it does. If it feels like some upgrades take forever to unlock, that's because you're doing it wrong. The game gives you no indication of this, of course. In actuality, the best way to unlock new abilities with a weapon is to use the right, previously unlocked ability. New abilities give you more weapon experience than old ones when you attack an enemy with them, to the point where it seems like eventually old ones give you nothing. I can't confirm that, but it certainly feels like it. You can go from getting both the Z-Saber and Buster Shot fully upgraded in about 10 minutes by doing it right, to both of them taking a half an hour each if you're just blindly attacking enemies. Effectively, I like the system, but I wish the game was crystal clear in how upgrading weapons worked in the first place, instead of giving me like 2 text boxes that explain it and that's it. Maybe the manual said more, but I highly doubt it. The other weapon-related option you have access to is elemental chips. There are 3 of them across the game: electric, fire, and ice. You can equip 1 at a time, and each of them affect charged attacks with your weapons. Most minor mobs won't really be affected by them much, because they die so fast, and larger mobs are sometimes not affected at all. Bosses are nearly all weak to 1 of the 3 chips. Sounds fine, and it mostly is. Once again though, there's a problem, aside from the fact that the chips just aren't that interesting. Bosses overall are actually solidly designed, thankfully, though if you know their weakness, they often become too easy, with some being a bit too hard without them. However, because you don't get abilities from bosses anymore, there is no weakness chain. The weakness chain is the elemental chips. And since there is no weakness chain other than the elemental chips, it's often impossible to tell which boss is weak to which chip. You'd think the desert boss, Anubis Necromancis, would maybe be weak to ice, right? Since he's Egypt-themed and hangs out in the desert. Nope, he's weak to fire. It makes sense that the ice-themed mermaid boss, Fairy Leviathan, is weak to fire though, yeah? And she is, but she's also underwater the whole time, meaning it also makes more sense that she'd be weak to electricity. Why would the fire even work? Fighting Fafnir? Copy X? What do you think they're weak to? Can you tell? Hidden Phantom isn't even weak to anything. which is fine in theory, but the problem is similar to what you'd find in earlier Mega Man games. Once they start doing more eccentric theming for the Mavericks, you have to more or less swap through each chip to see which one does real damage, likely causing you to take damage along the way. It's guesswork. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a big deal whatsoever. What makes it a big deal is how the game handles extra lives, saving, and missions, as well as the aforementioned ranking system if you care about that. So, lives themselves are pretty standard. Finding extra lives is very rare, but that's not the biggest deal on its own. What causes the real problem is that the game saves the amount of extra lives you have stocked. This means if you have a surplus beyond the 2 you begin with, that's great. But if you don't, let's say you beat a stage with no extra lives and then saved, then you're stuck with no retries until you find more extra lives. Across my entire playthrough and the thousands of enemies defeated, I think maybe 2 of them dropped extra lives, and there are maybe 8 or so that can be found hidden across all the stages. Meanwhile, once you finish a stage, returning to it in the overworld of sorts won't spawn that extra life, meaning you can only find them when on a mission. This means you can really easily screw yourself over, forcing you to reload the entire mission every time you die. But it gets worse when you factor in the decision to make missions permanently failable. That's right, if you run out of lives on a mission or abandon it, you will fail and you can't gain access to it again. Remember when I complained about elemental chips being guesswork across the game? Now do you understand why it's a problem to ask players to potentially take a handful of hits while figuring out a boss's weakness? This also makes the regular use of spikes and instant death pits extra cheap. And they even appear in a couple bosses along the way. You can get and upgrade the Cyber Elf that removes spikes, but that's like an extra 35 minutes of grinding that I didn't even do, a permanent hit to your rank, and makes getting the ultimate Cyber Elf impossible. Fun, right? That has other knock-on effects though, like making it so that any Cyber Elves you miss in that configuration of a stage are gone forever. That means the worse you do at the game, the harder the game continues to become, which is completely backwards and very unfriendly to learning players. As you might not expect though, the stack of issues continues to grow, becoming more and more unstable. For whatever ridiculous reason, cutscenes now trigger every time you enter a space where they would play, until you progress past it. Do you like hearing Zero and the stage boss banter every single time you die and have to restart? No? Too bad. Or what about saving and then turning the game back on? I decided to do all of my exploring and grinding for the remaining Cyber Elves I'd missed right before going to the Neo Arcadia stages, which are the equivalent to the Sigma and Wily stages. That meant a lot of experimentation and resets for the grinding, and a fair amount of deaths that I had to reset after while trying to find elves, because I'm not about to lose a bunch of extra lives I can't recover for no reason, right? Well, that also meant watching a cutscene with like 20 slow as molasses text boxes over and over and over and over again along the way, and without starting and completing the first Neo Arcadia stage, I had no way to make it stop. Then you have the stages themselves, which are almost all extremely drab, both visually and in terms of design. The layouts are rarely that complicated and usually consist of things like factories, prisons, and bases. Fun. Stages themselves are reused constantly, though they do sometimes change physical layouts and more or less always alter enemy layouts. But still, hearing the same music with the same stage, which all look the same over and over, all while fighting the rest of the game's design along the way, isn't particularly fun. One of the missions is even a tedious escort challenge, where you have to rescue a Reploid at the end of the stage and then slowly guide them back through the stage to the base, without getting them killed by enemies that can do things like spawn directly below them. Another mission is a boring base infiltration, where you free prisoners. Sounds okay until you realize half of the level, the prison section, is literally just 2 hallways with ladders leading to tiny prison cell rooms. rooms. That's it, and this level is reused as well later on, despite these rooms basically being useless on that revisit. And again, the music is reused constantly. I'm pretty sure a lot of different stages even use the same music, and revisits certainly do as well. Also, I hope you like the Resistance bass music, because it's what plays no matter where you go, as long as you're not on a mission, meaning you get that one song on loop for hours while grinding, if you use the later grinding spot like I did. The music itself is okay. It's solidly written, but since these games originated on the GBA, even the use of the more clear DS variants of the tracks can't completely eliminate the scratchy lo-fi GBA soundscape, which for me kills a lot of the music. It gets old fast when you're repeating the music this much. Graphically, the game at least looks pretty great, drab levels aside. I love the Zero and X redesigns and most of the character designs in general. They look edgy, but in a nice and futuristic kind of way. The story is at least an interesting idea as well. As I said, it takes place after Mega Man X ends, where Zero is canonically put into hibernation for 100 years to assess how much of a threat he ultimately is. Apparently, in that time, X has died, and then a copy of him has been resurrected by a scientist known as Seal. This new X becomes obsessed with keeping humans safe, to the point of more or less trying to eradicate every other Reploid, which are all labeled as Mavericks. The idea of an X gone mad is cool. Seeing minions that are modeled after him and getting to put him in his place is rad. But the storytelling is closer to the original X than X4 and beyond. There aren't that many cutscenes, and they don't say much of value within most of them. You don't really get to know the 4 protectors for Copy X or Copy X himself much at all, and before you know it, you're already facing them for the final time. What's more, some of the dialogue doesn't have the strongest translation, though that might have to do with character limits, so I can't be too hard on most of it. It's certainly better than some of the later X games, though there's one section which is just quintessential I don't know what to write here. Zero literally looks at what we know is going to turn into a devil-type enemy, and his first response is to say, "You're too big to be a slug, just get lost," which is about the cheesiest, dumbest, least badass thing I could imagine coming out of his mouth. Why a slug? If it's too big to be a slug, shouldn't you know what, never mind. I'm pretty confident that the subsequent Zero games get better than this in a multitude of ways, and I want to reiterate that this game can still find life once you get extremely good at it. But at least for me, the design is largely just a mess of ideas with great potential that weren't thought through well at all. It feels like half of the choices were made because that's how classic 2D platformers did it, while the other half were trying to be interesting and innovative, and they just don't mesh well, they all clash. Mega Man Zero isn't as bad as X5, X6, or X7. Hell, I'd argue it might even be better than X3, which is not a good game no matter how much I want to love it. But Zero One is also not where it needs to be, which is disappointing. It could have reached beyond the heights of X1 and X4, but instead falls way short. If you ever try it for the first time, hopefully you can get more out of the game than I can, particularly if you're using the modern console ports with their save assist feature. But as for me, I'll probably only play it as a novelty in the future, and certainly nowhere near as often as I play X1 and X4. I really do hope I like the other Zero games more than this. Only time will tell though. But what do you guys think? Have you played through Zero? Where do you place it in relation to the X titles and other Zero games? Did anything I haven't mentioned stand out to you when you played the game, good or bad? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.